At exactly 5 p.m., the back gate creaked open. Buster trotted into the yard, his pace steady and his tail held high. He crossed the grass, climbed the porch steps, and dropped his daily find with a dull thud against the wood. Without waiting for a greeting, he moved straight to his water bowl, lapping at the surface until the metal basin clattered against the floor. The family watched from the kitchen window, but they rarely moved to greet him. They were used to the routine. They stepped onto the porch to collect the offering. A crumpled soda can, a rusted bolt, or a soggy piece of cardboard. It was always trash. The father would pick up the item with 2 fingers, walk to the bin, and drop it inside without a second thought. They laughed about it at dinner, calling Buster a self-appointed janitor of the neighborhood. The dog never seemed to mind the lack of praise. The pattern persisted for weeks, day after day. They had no idea that every piece of refuse was a deliberate choice. The Tuesday arrival started differently. Buster did not trot to his bowl immediately. He stood on the porch, waiting until the father opened the door. He dropped a leather wallet at the man's feet. It was heavy, caked in dried mud, and the edges were frayed from exposure. The father knelt, wiped the grime from the surface, and clicked the clasp open. Inside, tucked behind a plastic sleeve, was an ID card. It belonged to a woman living 3 miles away. The father dialed the number listed on the card, his brow furrowed as he spoke into the receiver. Less than an hour later, a car pulled into the driveway. A woman stepped out, her face streaked with tears. She grabbed the wallet, clutching it against her chest, and explained she had lost it during a morning jog in the woods. She had been frantic, unable to find it for days. As she drove away, the silence on the porch felt heavy. The father looked at the dog, then back at the gate. The family gathered in the kitchen, the laughter from previous dinners replaced by a sharp, growing unease. They realized the items were not random refuse. The house felt different that evening. The father paced the kitchen floor, his eyes fixed on the back gate. The mother sat at the table, turning the memory of the woman's relief over in her mind. They spoke in low tones, mapping out the timeline of Buster's arrivals. Every piece of trash they had discarded now felt like a missed signal. The father stopped pacing and looked at the mother. "We follow him tomorrow," he said. It was not a suggestion. It was a plan. They spent the next hour checking their gear. They gathered sturdy boots, a heavy-duty flashlight, and a charged phone. The air in the kitchen shifted from domestic routine to the sharp, cold focus of an investigation. They watched Buster through the glass door as he slept. The dog was no longer just a pet. He was a guide, and they were finally ready to listen. They set their alarms for early afternoon. When the sun began to dip the next day, they were waiting by the door, watching the gate with bated breath, ready to step into the woods. The gate clicked, and Buster did not wait. He did not look back. He hit the grass at a full gallop, his head low, his body stretched into a blur of motion. The father sprinted to catch up, his boots sliding on the loose dirt of the yard. They crossed the property line and hit the dense forest edge. But Buster did not slow. He tore through the thick brush, ignoring the low-hanging branches that whipped against his sides. Usually, he would pause to sniff a trunk or dart after a squirrel, but today, he was a machine. He moved with a singular, terrifying purpose. The mother scrambled over a fallen log, her breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps as she tried to keep the golden tail in sight. Buster leaped over a shallow creek, his paws barely touching the mossy stones before he was airborne again, surging toward the deeper, darker sections of the woods. The family followed, stumbling through thorny thickets and uneven ground. Every time they slowed, the distance between them and the dog widened. The urgency in his stride was absolute, a silent command that forced the family to push past their own exhaustion. The sprint ended as abruptly as it had begun. Buster skidded to a halt, his claws digging deep into the soft earth at the very edge of a precipice. He did not look back at the family. He planted his front paws firmly and let out a sharp, rhythmic bark that echoed against the unseen walls below. The father caught up, his chest heaving, and grabbed a nearby sapling to steady himself. He looked down, but the light failed to penetrate the dense canopy. It was a ravine, steep and jagged, hidden completely from the path they had been following. The air here felt different, colder and heavy. Buster paced back and forth, his tail low, his barks growing more frantic, more desperate. He looked at the father, then back into the dark abyss. The mother reached the edge, her hand gripping the father's shoulder. They stood in silence, the forest around them suddenly devoid of birdsong. The father took a tentative step forward, his boot dislodging a stone that tumbled into the dark. It hit nothing for a long, agonizing second, landing with a dull, hollow thud. The dread was no longer a feeling, it was a physical weight, pressing down on them as they stared into the shadows. The father leaned further over the edge, squinting until his eyes watered. A stray beam of sunlight pierced the canopy, striking a jagged surface deep in the trench. It was metal, a bicycle frame, twisted into an impossible shape, lay half buried in the mud and rotted leaves. Beside the mangled spokes sat a small, worn backpack, its straps caked in dirt. The mother gasped, the sound sharp and jagged in the quiet air. She pointed, her finger trembling as she stared at the bag. "That is the one," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The news report. The boy who went missing 2 days ago." The father did not hesitate. He fumbled for his phone, his fingers slick with sweat, and punched in the emergency digits. He paced the rim of the ravine, shouting their location into the receiver while his eyes remained locked on the wreckage below. He looked at the mother, then at the dog. Buster sat perfectly still, his gaze fixed on the backpack, his ears pricked. The first siren cut through the trees, a high-pitched wail that sent birds scattering into the sky. Within minutes, the quiet clearing was a blur of activity. Rescue workers in heavy gear swarmed the edge of the ravine, uncoiling thick ropes and securing anchors to the ancient oaks. The father and mother stepped back, forced to watch as the professionals descended into the dark. Every minute felt like an eternity. They stood at the perimeter, hands clasped, eyes glued to the ropes that vibrated with the weight of the climbers. Down in the shadows, flashlights cut through the gloom, dancing over the wreckage. A voice shouted up from the depths, distorted by the steep walls, but the tone was urgent. The father gripped the mother's arm as a stretcher was lowered. Silence fell over the rescue team. They worked with surgical precision, moving debris aside to reach the small, still form huddled near the mangled bike. A collective breath seemed to hold the forest in place. Then, the signal came. The team began the slow, steady haul upward. As the stretcher cleared the rim, a small hand moved, clutching at the air. The boy was pale and shivering, but his chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm. He was alive. The mother let out a sob that broke the tension. The ambulance doors swung open, the interior lights casting a sterile, white glow against the darkening forest floor. Paramedics moved with practiced efficiency, tucking blankets around the boy and checking his pulse as the engine began to hum. The father stepped closer, his eyes drawn to the boy's small, trembling hands. Despite the chaos, the child held on to something with a fierce, desperate grip. It was a small, worn toy, its surface matted with forest grit. The father froze. He recognized the object instantly. It was the exact item Buster had dropped on their porch just a week ago. He looked back toward the dog, who sat motionless by the ambulance door. The boy's fingers tightened around the toy, his knuckles white. A sudden, chilling clarity washed over the father. This was not a random piece of debris. He watched as the boy pulled the toy closer to his chest. Every item Buster had brought home had been a calculated step in a trail. The dog had been mapping the path, piece by piece. The realization settled in the air as the ambulance doors finally latched shut. The ambulance pulled away, its red lights fading into the thick canopy until only the sound of gravel crunching under tires remained. Silence reclaimed the clearing. The father and mother stood still, the weight of the last few weeks pressing down on them with sudden, sharp clarity. They looked at Buster. He was not panting, not chasing shadows, not looking for a reward. He sat perfectly upright, his gaze fixed on the spot where the ambulance had been, his tail resting against the damp earth. The father thought back to the soda can, the rusted bolt, the soggy cardboard. Every single item had been a desperate, calculated plea for help. They had been blind to the map he was building right at their feet. Buster stood up, shook the forest dust from his fur, and turned toward the path. He walked with a steady, measured gait, his work finished. The mother reached out, her hand trembling as she touched the top of his head. He simply kept moving, leading them back through the brush, back over the creek, and back to the gate. As they emerged from the woods, the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in deep, bruised purples. They followed him into the yard, watching as he trotted toward his water bowl, drank deeply, and then curled up on the porch. He was just a dog, yet the silence he left in his wake felt profound. They had been saved by a creature who had spent weeks screaming for help.